So now we will then move on to this next panel. Those of you coming in here, just ask you to just take your seats relatively quietly, please. We're also relatively short on time for this panel. So we have, the panel's title is A New Territorial Agenda Post-2020, Delivering More Effective Governance. What we're going to do is we're going to have 3 quick introductions from the 3 speakers that are to my right. Then I'll take a quick round of questions only from the Slido app in between, before then going to the 3 panelists that are over here to my left-hand side. And then we'll do a larger round of Q&A, and we have time for this panel up until 3 o'clock. Each panelist will give a short introduction of between 5 and 7 minutes to giving their take on this topic, and then we'll move then to the next panelist, and then we'll come to the question and answers. So the first half of the panel is looking at the problems of territorial fragmentation, and our first speaker over furthest away from me to the right-hand side is Erik Gloersen, who works on the ESPON Bridges project. So Erik, over to you for your introduction, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. So I'm coordinating, as Jon just mentioned, the ESPON Bridges project, which deals with mountains, islands, sparsely populated areas, and coastal areas, so specific areas. And what strikes, I've been working on this for 15 years now, and on this topic, on and off. And what triggered it in the beginning was the European Treaty that started actually developing a narrative on these territories. And I would like to explain why we have a problem with a narrative that simply doesn't function. What this Article 174 of the treaty says, they approach these mountains, islands, sparsely populated areas as regions concerned by backwardness and handicaps. So this, the storyline, the narrative is basically, well, you're mountainous, so you have a handicap, and because you have a handicap, you will be backward. So that's what landed, this narrative that landed at the Commission, and they had to decide what to do about it. So they launched these studies in the 2000s, and they found that there was no significant pattern of backwardness. So you looked at the evidence and you couldn't, the narrative simply didn't fit with any facts. And then the conclusion for that was, oh, then we're not having any specific programs for these areas. So basically the whole issue, you had a narrative that didn't fit with the facts, and so no specific programs. And this continues today, as with the European Parliament, the parliamentarians are still very preoccupied by these areas. So you have intergroups, you have parliamentarians coming together and voting resolutions on the fact that you would need specific measures for these areas. And the Commission comes back and dismisses these requests with reference to diversity of these areas. So there is really an issue of an impossible dialogue between 2 groups. When for regional stakeholders, people living in these areas, it seems so obvious that they are different, that they need specific arrangements for their situation. And this is then translated into parliamentarians. And the European Commission replies on the basis of statistical observations that there is no significant pattern of laggardness, and that these areas are not functional areas, so they, in terms of socioeconomic terms, so there is no real reason to focus on them. So really a typical example where the European citizen can feel that the European Union does not understand their specific challenges and cannot help addressing them. And it is then the paradox that the European level says that there is no room for European policy, and at the same time, we have lobby groups, so the regions come together spontaneously. There are big conferences on these topics. We have intergroups at the European Parliament dealing with this. So people spontaneously feel that this is a topic, but then policy-wise, it's just not possible to translate it into policy, it's just dismissed. So the underlying hypothesis somehow at the European Union level could be, well, these people don't know their own good. They come together, but actually, they shouldn't have any reason to come together because, well, there is no real reason to focus on them. One possible answer could be to say that, well, this argument is not irrelevant. If people come together, if people are prepared to communicate and have this cooperation and these types of soft interaction which we have heard about this morning, maybe that's reason enough to build a policy, because people are coming together. So this is a context where you can use this as a lever to construct policies. So should you really then use the fact that you have evidence that doesn't fit be really a criterion to dismiss the entire topic? A second answer is more in terms of what do we need, what are these levers for? So maybe we are not talking precisely of a policy addressing social economic disparities, we're talking about solving solutions. So if you think of a cohesion policy that is result-oriented and want to solve concrete issues, maybe these areas are relevant for very specific topics. So maybe it's meaningful to deal with mountains when you are trying to find solutions to make more resilient areas in the face of climate change. Maybe water resources are more difficult to manage in islands, so addressing cooperation, territorial cooperation for water is meaningful in islands, and they may need European impulses on that. Or landscape management can be relevant in mountain islands, sparsely populated areas. So topic-wise, if we bring in the territorial dimension of these more sectoral specific challenges, these territories suddenly start having another meaning. And third, there is a possibility of then developing mountains and sparsely populated areas as a narrative which is not holistic, which is not integrated, but is then focusing on these specific parts. So then if we take this stance, what can ESPON do about it? How can ESPON as a program try to feed into these and help these types of developments? Well, first about circumscribing these fields. We've heard about territorialism. We know that territorial actors tend spontaneously to think of their own area as a place where we should have our own strategy. We should have built something closing the borders and saying, well, this is what we want to do in our area with these borders. Well, maybe circumscribing what fields, giving some hints of what kind of governance could be meaningful, taking these specificities as a starting point, these geographic specificities. Second, really operationalizing. So this dialogue we observe at the European level, we see that there is a narrative that spontaneously emerges in this dialogue between actors, but the European mountain doesn't exist. The mountains, actors from different parts of Europe come to these discussions with different mountains in mind, different islands, all have a different idea actually. So constructing these types of notions at European level actually requires, it's much less trivial than it may seem. This needs to be built up, constructed with support from experts such as those gathered in program as ESPON. So just to conclude, I think this makes it worthwhile. To work on these topics at the European level because of their potential as levers of multi-level governments. It can help to make EU regional policy and territorial cohesion ambitions, bring them closer to the citizens. We have narratives such as community-led local development, integrated territorial investment. We see that they do not function as well as we wish they would. It is a very abstract notion. Imagine that we translate this into a mountain initiative. It's still doing the same thing. We're still saying, well, integrated territorial investment or community-led local development in specific areas, but we're not presenting it as some kind of abstract notion like that. We are bringing together actors that simultaneously have the same idea, the same representations, and we bring something that is closer to the preoccupation of the citizens, and that may be then caught and taken on board by them in a whole other way than an abstract notion, such as community-led local development or integrated territorial investments. So I just want to show how you can then move from an initial narrative that was very much, we are focusing on laggedness, and it doesn't work statistically, it doesn't work for the actors, to something which is more result-oriented and trying to bring general solutions closer to the citizens by playing on their perceptions and their own sense of belonging to specific territories, to specific types of territories, and to categories that are pan-European. Thank you.
Right, excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Our second speaker is Thomas Dax, who is from the Federal Institute for Less Favored and Mountainous Areas in Austria, no doubt building upon or perhaps disagreeing with in part what Erik has just said. So Thomas, over to you.
Thank you. Indeed, I can continue very well from what Erik just said, and we cooperated in other work. I was partner in the ESPON project Prophecy on inner peripheries, on which I will have my intervention here. But before that, I'd like to remind us of an earlier ESPON project, the EDORA project, which dealt with European development opportunities for rural regions, showing that we should not only face these rural regions as regions of backwardness, of limited options, but we should also see what opportunities they have. And in that project, we particularly dealt with the predominant narratives which are in place. And we could see the former agri-centric narratives, well, for many regions and for many actors in those regions, they are outdated. We would have to deal much more with new narratives on rural-urban interlinkages, on spatial interaction in particular, and also include many drivers for spatial changes through non-spatial interrelations, which was very important at that period about 10 years ago now. Now, when I heard the two keynote speeches today, I liked that very much, that they emphasize very strongly that we have to think beyond administrative units, beyond state borders, that we have to address those places that don't matter in our mainstream economy. And it's specifically what the ESPON project Prophecy, well, tried to start to discuss. The inner peripheries, inner peripheries is an oxymoron. Well, they are not meant to be the strongly peripheral regions at the edge of the European scale, but they are defined by relative socioeconomic weaknesses, by unfavorable processes, and specifically so in comparison to their surrounding neighboring regions. So it might be an inner peripheral situation for one country, which might be favorable in contrast to other countries. But the feeling and the appreciation in the region would be that there is some gap to the neighboring regions. In this aspect, it is particularly important that we have to deal with a very low scale of analysis. So the territorial fragmentation here is very important when we want to deal with the situations of people in those regions. We found three main cases of such inner peripheries. One are typical enclaves of low economic potential. Then we found areas which show very poor access to services of general interest. And of course, they can overlap these cases. And there are cases where areas are lacking relational proximity, which cannot be easily covered by our usual statistics. So many non-spatial factors, processes are coming in here. Our main concern with the inner peripheral areas was that this territorial fragmentation is so important that it needs a specific analysis at a very fine geographical detail. And that is, of course, a significant problem in the analysis. Because we have very often internal differences within the region, however we define them. We have to go really to very small units to get homogeneous situations. And in many cases, even there, we detect internal differences. From a global, from a large-scale perspective, this could not be seen, and this looks negligible. But for the people themselves, it's a very important aspect that we pay attention to these differences. Very often, the decisive indicator for good practice in development for those regions or for failure is the kind of communication, the kind of interaction they could develop both internally and externally with other regions. So this is very, very decisive for the regional development. I'd like to add a warning. Very often when we speak about internal peripheries, we we are driven into the discussion of urban-rural exchange, urban-rural relationships. But it's not just that. It should go beyond that, because many of these relationships, they are not just directed towards the next city or the next town, but they show other kind of relationships, and very often it's an important influence shown there through the institutional framework in those areas. With regard to policy recommendations, we discussed that at all the different levels. Of course, it's important to include the discussion here at the different administrative levels. And we discussed policy integration, integrated approaches, etc. We are a little bit skeptical of demanding such high and very challenging policy changes and developments. In effect, it will be very important that we focus on practical and practical solutions, and we focus also to address the scientific limitations we have when we deal with these aspects. Very often, it's important to add to the kind of programs Erik just indicated, some other policies, neighboring policies, and to argue about the supplementary and the complementary roles of the different policy frameworks. So an all-including, comprehensive policy proofing seems over-exaggerated in many of the cases. The prime task, what the case studies we carried out in the prophecy project was that people are looking for how their specific areas could be made more attractive and how they could be linked to the nearby centers. We also argued about how this could be initiated, how this policy process could take place. And we really find this is a very, very long-term process, with many important steps in it. I'm not going to speak of all the details there, but it's very important to understand also the trade-offs between the policies, not to pretend, well, adding another program would solve the existing problems. The other kind of activity I'd like to mention, because we very often overlook it, is the development of capacity in these small scales. It's overlooked because we think, well, we will have some pull effect from other actions. But in the end, as Andres showed in his presentations, people there very often feel like they are overlooked in their strategies. Thank you.
All right. You were coming to the end anyway. Sorry about that. Apologies there. Right. Our next speaker is Simin Davoudi, who is Professor of Environment Policy and Planning and Director of the Global Urban Research Unit at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape of the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. I forgot to give the full title. So Simin, over to you for your introduction.
Thank you very much, Jon, and thanks for asking me to come and share my ideas with colleagues and friends here. I'm going to talk about one of the key concerns raised by this seminar, which is the lack of visibility and leverage of territorial agenda in the EU cohesion policy, despite the various commitments made in the Territorial Agenda 2020. And I'm going to suggest that this gap between what's been said and what's been done is largely due to the hollowing out of the original territorial narrative and the failure of constructing a new one. We heard this morning and subsequently that narratives matter. I want to say a few words, I have very little time, why and how they matter. Narratives matter because they are the means by which people, including policymakers, navigate and make sense of the world. Social psychologists have shown that narratives perform a fundamental cognitive function. They help our emotional brain to make sense of the information that is collected by our rational brain. When we encounter a complex issue, let's say Brexit, we try to make sense of it, not by searching for more and more facts and figures about its economic impact, but by seeking comprehensible narratives that match our attitudes and values. So narrative conformity becomes more important to us than scientific rationality. Of course, scientific knowledge is vital for alerting our rational brain that something's wrong or there is an issue there. But on their own, they do not galvanize our emotional brain into action to do something about it, about the problem, to put it right. So a string of well-attested facts and figures, or a set of beautifully crafted maps that show a growing territorial disparities and fragmentations in Europe are good, but they are not enough for mobilizing policy change. For that, we also need a powerful narrative. The importance of narrative is already being recognized by the Intergovernmental Task Force for TA 2020+, which highlights the need for, and I quote, developing narratives for the political embedding of the agenda. The term embedding is very important here, because to be embedded in policy and practice, narratives need a firm and clear value base. Values are the bedrocks of effective narratives. Without them, we cannot judge what is good. We do not know whether it's better to invest in places where they will generate the greatest returns, as we heard this morning, or in places where they will generate the greatest territorial balance. The choice is a value choice. Without clearly articulated values, narratives become hollowed out and toothless. They lose their ability to become embedded in political discourse and influence policies and practices. And that is what has happened to the original territorial narratives. It's lost its underpinning values. Let me remind you what it was. The original narrative was about balancing development. It was about reducing regional disparities. It was included in the 1957 Treaty of Rome. It informed the EU regional policy. It was reiterated in the ESDP. And also, finally, it was consolidated in the Lisbon Treaty through the concept of territorial cohesion. So throughout that journey, the narrative remained meaningful because it was based on a set of value systems which were rooted in social democratic ideals of fairness, solidarity, cohesion, and cooperation. Its most simple yet powerful articulation appeared in the third cohesion report, which said people should not be disadvantaged by wherever they happen to live or work in the Union. But by the time TA 2020 came out, the political landscape of Europe had already begun to shift towards a different set of values, rooted in neoliberal ideals of competition, competitiveness, atomization of responsibility, and regions for themselves. This created a mismatch between what was being said and what was being done. The social democratic value base of the original territorial narrative was no longer in harmony with the values that underpin the broader politics of the EU. In other words, the narrative was hollowed out of its underlying values and became a paper tiger. If the Intergovernmental Task Force is serious about embedding a territorial narrative in the EU policies, they need to be clear and make it explicit what their value choices are. And they have to make the choice between constructing a new narrative that conforms to the mainstream neoliberal agenda, that some places are better than others, or renewing the social democratic values of the original narrative, that all places matter. Irrespective of the choice, I think there are a couple of points that are important for effective narratives. Narratives are most effective when they are simple, engaging, and inspirational. When they capture people's imagination and mobilize their emotional brains into action. And they can only do that when they are based on clearly articulated values that can guide decisions and actions. And only then they can dislodge other competing narratives. And so far, and this applies to ESPON to some extent as well, we've had a lot of useful data about growing territorial inequalities. What we desperately need now is a compelling story about what to do about it. A positive story that appeals to as many people as possible and motivates them to demand policy change.
Thank you very much. A clear and challenging point of view there. I was particularly struck by the no more of the social democratic base, the words you repeated multiple times there, something perhaps we want to talk about in the discussion. I've just had a quick look at Slido, and there aren't so many questions that have come in there yet. So if you do have questions on your mind, we've got 2 that are there so far, but I think actually, we've got a 3rd question coming in. To the 3 of you over to that side, would any of you like to have a go at any of those particular questions? People interested in coming together, why is the URBAC project coming to an end? Are familiar regional and national narratives compatible with the narrative of globalization, or are they outdated? That's perhaps one for you, Simin. And we like to discuss the narratives we'd like to live with, but never the actually existing narratives that we live with, e.g. capitalization, competition, the market, etc., which I think, again, is one which was based on your presentation there. So the other 2 gentlemen, are there any of those questions that you feel are directed to you or you'd like to have a go at answering? Is neoliberalism dead for now? No, right. In which case, I'm going to then ask you, Simin, about the second and the third questions there.
Right, thank you. Thanks very much. Well, I'm just trying to get myself back into sort of me, and now I've got to answer some questions. Fantastic. I think there is one thing about this point which is really important, and whoever has raised it, thank you very much for saying that, in terms of our kind of regional, national, and the globalization. And I think that the answer to that is that we should move away from the idea of place-based. Because there is something that, and I've been one of the people who have used that phrase over and over again, but I'm coming to a point that place-based, there is a risk in overusing the word place-based, that it can turn the place into a bounded container. It could be very inward-looking. It could be very thinking about places as isolated from the rest of the world. And that is why place-sensitive, the one that Andres said, and I have also heard, and I have used place-informed policy, probably is a better phrase to use, because then it says that we cannot ignore globalization. We cannot ignore the impact of what's happening in other places on our place. So it's not just about looking inside and seeing what happens in my place. You do that, and the place is very important. All places matter, I do subscribe to that. But also be aware of what happens in terms of the globalizing impact of many various processes. So I don't see them as contradiction if we take that perspective.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Just there was a question there on the building policies around people who want to come together. I can't talk about this URBAC, but I just think we should clarify what we mean with the policy. A policy doesn't mean, for example, a dedicated program or funding. It can be just about lifting the issues, making sure that the issues that appear important to people within their region, within their locality, are actually reflected at European level, that you have a forum to exchange, that there is some kind of development of orientations of guidance. So this can be a part of the kind of policies I had in mind, certainly, around these issues of geographic specificities. And the fact that people spontaneously come together is a lever to develop that kind of thinking, that kind of support. So just clarifying what we mean with the policy, I think, is important in that respect.
Okay. Let's stop there for that round of questions. Some of those questions may also be relevant to our next panelists.